Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. My name is Steve Barker, and I'm here with my colleague Linda Waghorn this morning to welcome you to this hot topic session. Just a couple of brief housekeeping points, if we can, before we kick off this morning. We've got a large number of people joining us, so a very warm welcome to you all. Hopefully you can all see the go-to toolbar on your screen. If you can't, there should be a little orange box with a white arrow in it. If you click on that, it will reveal the toolbar. And on the toolbar, there's just a couple of things that are important to note. You'll see the little document icon. If you click on that at any time during the webinar or immediately afterwards, you can actually download the copy of the slides that we're going to share with you this morning. You'll also see the little grey box that says questions in it. Any questions at any time, just click on that box and type the question in, and as soon as you hit send, it will appear in front of us, and between us, Linda and I will do our best to try and answer those questions for you. And you've got a little hand icon. Could I ask you to just click on that and raise your hand now, just to indicate that you can hear us okay, please? Lovely, and I know I can see lots of people have actually done this before, so I can see you all raising your hands now. Just a few moments while we see if everybody else is. Yeah. That's looking pretty good, so I'll put your hands down for you now. That's fantastic, thank you. And with no more ado, as you can probably guess, I'm the person on the left-hand side of your screen, and Linda is on the right-hand side of the screen. Good morning, Linda.
Good morning, everyone.
And as we say, between us, Linda and I will guide you through the webinar this morning, but please, this is your opportunity to ask questions, so do keep those questions coming. Depending on the volume of questions we get, we may actually group some of them together, so if we don't mention you by name, please don't think it's because we're ignoring you. Okay, so with no more ado, the topics that we're going to cover in this morning's session. We've got some latest attendance data that's been published by the DfE and of a couple of weeks ago now, refers to the autumn term, so pre-COVID-19. And again, we'll just use that as a reminder to say a little bit about attendance. Department for Education has passed some new statutory instruments to enforce regulations regarding to exclusion, so we're going to say a little bit about that. A reminder that the new relationship, sex and health education regulations and the statutory duties surrounding those are still coming into force in September, so something to think about there. A little bit of news on school capital funding that applies to academies as well as maintained schools. Then we have a new safeguarding initiative called Hidden Harm, which was launched a couple of weeks back, which we're going to say a little bit about. And then last but by no means least, the government's mantra at the start of the school lockdown, school closure programme, was that governance continues in our schools, and we thought we'd just put a little bit of reminder in at the end of the session today of some of the things that business as usual for governance ought to look like in the summer term, and we'll put a couple of caveats on those as we go through. But nonetheless, just a couple of hopefully memory joggers for us there. Okay, so we're going to start off on the first topic, which is attendance, and as I said in the introduction, this is data that has come out relatively recently. As you can see the date at the bottom there, the 28th of May, so it was actually a week ago today. And as always, the department spends quite a bit of time analysing data and collating it before it's actually published. This is actually done through the National Statistics Office, and it then gets published back on the Department for Education part of the .gov.uk website. This relates to the autumn term, and the reason why I thought this is important, clearly the current situation with schools in either still partially or fully closed and in that reopening mode, we're not talking about the current situation. This is the information for the autumn term, so before any schools were impacted on by COVID-19 at all. And I think if we just move on and look at the statistics here, you can see some of the information that's actually jumping out at us here is that all four of these key headline measures that the government actually use show an increase from the previous year. And I think this is something that we did point out to a lot of governors in the autumn term when the previous data was actually published. This is just a bit of a flag that although Ofsted are not coming at the moment, and we don't do what we do because Ofsted are coming, we know that Ofsted will be focusing on attendance. Attendance is a key issue in the attitudes and behaviour judgment. And nationally, there is a bit of a trend at the moment that attendance seems to be slipping. Now, there can be a whole variety of different reasons for that, but nonetheless, the indicators here are quite concerning. So the overall absence rate has actually gone up from 4.3% overall up to nearly 5%, 4.93%. And I think they've all gone up, as I say, but I think the other really concerning one is that big jump over 30% in the persistent absenteeism, the bottom right of those blue boxes on that slide there. And we're not going to spend a huge amount of time analysing the data with you this morning. Everything that we're referring to in this webinar, we've given you a URL link on the penultimate slide, just that if you want to find out more, if you want to look at this data in more detail, you have the opportunity to do that. And I think the one thing that we would say is that this is something that governors need to be thinking about. Do you know what your data was in the autumn term? And of course, that leads to us thinking about a whole range of different questions, some of which we're putting up on this slide in front of you now. These are questions for governors to reflect upon and possibly take back to their school or to their trust. The first one: do we as governing boards actually receive the regular attendance data that gives us that comparison on an ongoing basis to national figures? Schools historically have tended to look at the annual national figure and make comments about that, but the government now is producing termly data. Are we actually using that as a benchmark for attendance in our own schools? And I think that's something that a lot of us ought to think about. Whether that comes to whole governing body or through a committee, that doesn't actually matter. It's the fact that governance is aware of what attendance rates are in the school, and of course, more importantly, that third bullet point there: what is the school or the trust actually doing about it? And then, if you think about the last bullet point, fine, yes, we need to know what the school's doing, but then we need to think about what difference is it making. Are we improving attendance? If not, should we be trying something else? Okay, so I'm going to move on at that point and slides move, there we go, and hand over to Linda, who's going to talk to the next point on exclusions.
I'm going to say a little bit more here about exclusions because there has been a recent change and it is a temporary change. So during the school closures, clearly the face-to-face meetings, panel meetings of all kinds that governors might, in rare examples, need to set up to hear various things, cannot take place because of the spread of the virus. And so there was some regulations changes in terms of some of the panel hearings, but of course anything to do with an exclusion is very much around the future education of that young person, and so it is incredibly important. So fairly recently they made a temporary change to and passed new regulations. So this is now statutory, as it says at the top of this page here. You can see it says statutory guidance, so it must be followed, and the changes that they have made are to enable the process of reviewing that exclusion and making sure that it has been correctly carried out and is in the interest of all parties. That guidance now has been amended to reflect the current situation. So it covers all of the things that you would expect to see: a remote access to a virtual meeting with the agreement of all parties, so that the process itself can be fully completed in a time frame that allows that young person then to have the knowledge and security about where their future lies in terms of that review. So if we look at the next slide, it's got a little bit more detail for us. The new regulations were published on the 29th of May. They cover exclusions that take place from the period 1st of June to the 24th of September. So covering that period of time when young people and children are returning to school in some way, shape or form. And they amend the previous regulations that were in force when schools were open in the normal process. There is an expectation here, because we've got a 24th of September date on these new regulations, that temporary nature will finish at that point, and we will revert to some form of managing the process in the way that existed before. We don't know that, but at the moment this is a temporary change. It varies the usual rules around how we hold meetings, so that the availability and the setup of virtual meetings with all parties, that is now enshrined in regulation, and the normal process applies in its entirety, with the addition of a 10-day extension to the timeframes that were there before, and that is to allow the setting up of the virtual meeting arrangements. So there is a few things that we need to think about as governors and trustees. We need to make sure that, first of all, our school leadership team is aware that these new regulations are in force, so that we're making sure that we're holding the school to account for meeting their legal responsibilities, all of those compliance aspects. But probably the greater one here, because we're talking about the education of an individual child or young person, is, has the school undertaken risk assessments about those pupils who, because of their behaviour previously, could be at risk as they return to school? So for a number of young people, they will not have had that structure, the expectations in terms of their behaviour at home for a considerable amount of time when they start returning to school. Now, although this is primarily a problem in secondary schools, it does happen in primary school, so there will be some primary school children that will fit into this category, but so it's by no means just a secondary issue. But for those young people who have been off school for a significant amount of time, who have been not guided in their behaviour at home, they are going to have going to be in need of some extra support as they come back to school and they settle back down, not only to the normal that they knew before, but to a different normal, which probably has more stringent rules attached to it. And one, how do they manage to understand and obey the rules, and then how are the sanctions that are taken in order to enforce those rules managed in relation to their needs? So it's important that the school understands their at-risk group, and that governors ask what is being put in place to support that return to school and the learning of shaping of their behaviour to the expectations that the school will have in place when they return.
And I think it's worth adding there, Linda, that actually that group may, of course, be significantly bigger than it has always been. Most schools will have a small number of pupils who perhaps they consider are at risk of exclusion, but for all those reasons you've just said, I think from a governance point of view, we might want to be extending our thinking here way before we get to exclusion. What is the school doing in a much broader context to avoid anybody getting anywhere near perhaps being included within that at-risk group?
I'll come on and say a little bit more about that under the next heading, but I think you're absolutely correct there, Steve. For many young people, the anxiety of having to learn in a different way, and schools have been amazing in what they've provided to scaffold learning for pupils at home. But for children who don't have the support and supervision, or they may not have parents who understand the work that's been set or can help them through that, some of those children's anxiety may well come out in behaviour at school, and they may feel overwhelmed, and some young people, well, some adults included here, when things feel overwhelming, their behaviour often isn't what you would expect in normal times. So I think you're absolutely right. The reintroduction of pupils into school and the support for a whole range, from those who have been incredibly well supported right the way down to those who haven't had any support, and understanding and unpicking that is going to be a huge undertaking for schools and teachers and support staff. Some of these young people at risk of exclusion, the ones that we knew already, will likely have been supported in some way in their classrooms by teaching assistants and sometimes with other staff to help them in managing their own behaviour. So we're going to move on now and talk a little bit about relationships and sex and health education. This is not a new topic, and for any of you that have joined any of our previous webinars, we've talked about the role of governance. This we had quite a long lead in terms of its full introduction. So originally we had a set of guidance that was created back at the beginning of the 2000s, 2002, and this was the first major overhaul of the guidance, and that is not to say that the majority of schools hadn't included some of the new elements of what is shown in this guidance in the meantime, but the guidance didn't relate specifically to some of those areas. And this is largely about inclusion, about understanding that we live in a society that has a wide range of difference, and about managing our own educational needs in terms of what we need to learn about relationships, starting with friendship and moving right the way into making a relationship with an individual, and then linking that on at a later stage to sex education. And within all of that, from the minute a child starts school to the minute they leave school, managing and becoming responsible for their own health and well-being. So there's a whole range of different aspects contained within this guidance, and schools will have been compliant with some of it already because they would already have put things in place as a natural consequence of life in a more modern society. It was introduced and some schools piloted full compliance by September 2019, and schools and academies were encouraged to put in place as much by 2019 as they could, but it actually comes into force fully, so it's mandatory by this September. So for many of you, you will have had conversations with your school or academy about the new curriculum for relationships, health and sex and health education, but possibly you wouldn't have had that final conversation that says we are now fully compliant, we are ready to go. It may have been contained within other conversations that you had around the development of the curriculum generally, to meet those new Ofsted expectations under the curriculum. But there is an expectation now that the readiness, the preparation has all taken place, and the full new curriculum is in place from the 1st of September in all its aspects. And there were elements of this where consultation with parents, where training of staff will have been necessary, and those are the sorts of things that as a board you should have been marking the progress and monitoring whether this is now fully understood by all of the community and ready to be implemented in its entirety for September. So we're going to launch a poll here around this.
Sorry to interrupt, Linda. Just before we come to the poll, we've got a question that's come in on the risk assessments linked to the exclusion guidance from James. It's quite a long question, so and no judgment implied in that, James. But James is saying he's suspecting that teachers struggling to create new timetables, ways of working, etc., are unlikely to devote time to writing risk assessments for potential exclusions at the current time. And then wouldn't it be better just to put an addendum to the end of the policy? I think the only thing I would say there, James, is that yes, of course, teachers are professionals. They are constantly thinking about the needs of all of the pupils in their class, and the point that we're making both under the exclusions guidance and what Linda's just said about relationship, sex and health education is that, you know, a lot of the context for those pupils has changed, and therefore teachers will be thinking about it. But it's really important for the most vulnerable pupils that there are appropriate risk assessments in place, because if it were to go to a permanent exclusion, for example, or even a fixed term exclusion, if you've got pupils with special educational needs, but all pupils, the school has to be able to demonstrate that they have actually responded to the needs of those pupils. So we're certainly, so please don't think we're suggesting there's a massive great bureaucracy requirement here. There really isn't. But what this is saying is that as governors, we need to seek assurance from our schools that they are thinking about those changed circumstances, those changed contexts, and therefore will take that into account in perhaps the sanctions, the behavioural expectations of pupils in this very challenging period that we're finding ourselves in at the moment.
And I think we're not introducing something that's new in terms of children at risk of exclusion. So maybe we're thinking with our current governance heads on around risk assessments for reopening, not quite the same in that way. Risk assessments for pupils in danger of exclusion have always been there, and often the response to those were that they provided extra classroom support or behaviour management ideas, or extra ways of managing, you know, particularly I'm thinking of things in primary school where children have tools which they can identify their own feelings when they're getting upset or angry, and they can take appropriate action. So those things are all part of that programme of management of behaviour, which would have been based on the risk assessment, whatever it looks like. And what we're adding there is saying that for some children who weren't already having some support for their behaviour because it was recognised that they needed that support, there will be another group of children who will come back to school who hadn't previously demonstrated any of those behaviours that may need extra support. And I think schools are well prepared for that. Some of the conversations you've had in your risk assessment about return to school has covered mental health. There's been a huge amount that has been provided to support that, both at school returning and during the closures. And you'll also have some of those children who we already knew were at risk, whose behaviour, and staff will know that it probably will have got worse in the time that they haven't been at school. So I don't think it's as onerous as possibly it sounds. The response to it will be important for board members to understand, because if you were to be a member of a panel that was having to hear an exclusion, you are testing whether the school has done everything it could do in order to support that child and help them remain in school. And that is where it then is for not only that child's good, but it's also for your good as a board member sitting at a panel to ensure that those things have happened, so that you can properly unpick the route and the process and understand that the child has been as well supported as they possibly can, even if it is going to lead to a fixed term or permanent exclusion from their school.
We've got a couple more questions here on exclusions and attendance generally. Sandra's asking a question: if pupils don't have to be at school and return, but their behaviour, which has always been difficult, manifests itself, if they're asked to continue to home school rather than actually stay at school because of their breaking the rules and putting other pupils and staff at risk, is this exclusion? Yes, Sandra, it absolutely is. Schools cannot, the rules, the law is absolutely crystal clear on this. Schools cannot ask pupils to leave school, to have cooling off periods, to go home, etc. That is an exclusion, however long or short it may be. So there's no such thing as an unofficial exclusion, and we should all bear in mind that that has not changed. Alison's got a question here, Linda, which I don't know whether you want to come back on. Alison's saying, as governors, how would we be assured that individual risk assessments have been done?
Well, we don't need the individual detail, but we would need assurance that that had been carried out. So we would be asking those general questions around what sorts of things are in place to support children who we know may be facing behavioural difficulties when they come back to school. That covers all of those children, both the existing ones and the new ones. But then you would expect your head teacher to probably go into some detail about specific support for those children that they knew, and it would just give you some examples of the sorts of things that they would be doing in the classroom at break times, additional support or expectations or conversations with those pupils, or in some cases they made contracts with the family about attendance and support and expectations. So it won't be the same in every school, but the board's question here is around generally what has happened and what is the confidence level that the things that the school have put in place will support that young person in the best way that can possibly be done. Because we're not saying here that everybody's got a magic wand that will make challenging behaviour go away in an instant, because that just doesn't exist. But it's about the school doing everything that it can. And so then if it is attested at an exclusion hearing or a review, that it can demonstrate that it did everything it can, and despite those efforts, the incident or the behaviours that led to the exclusion occurred. But it wasn't because the school was negligent in trying to offer that support.
Okay, we had a couple of questions also coming in, which I think your last response answers, Linda, specifically with youngsters on the autism spectrum, etc. And yes, absolutely, it's not for us as governors, as Linda says, to ask individually, but yes, if we know we've got children with on the ASD spectrum in the school, then we would want to make sure that because of their very specific needs, that they've actually been taken into account in those risk assessments as well. So let's move on and launch the poll now. And what this poll is doing is actually bringing us back to the relationship, sex and health education, and asking the question, how has your school actually responded to that? So I'm going to launch the poll now. And that should appear. Unfortunately, I don't have a view of what you can see, so I hope that's actually on your screen now.
Yes, it is, Steve.
Lovely. Yeah, I can see some people are voting already, so you can choose as many of these as you'd like to. Please, if you're finding it difficult to vote, one of the tricks that we've discovered when we've got a lot of people on these webinars, sometimes if you've got your computer set for full screen mode, if you temporarily just minimize the screen, that should allow you to vote if you're having a difficulty doing that at the moment. Okay, so we've got just over 80% of you vote. So if you would like to vote, folks, a couple more moments, and then we're going to close that poll down. Right, okay, I think that's just about everybody going to vote has done so now. So I'm going to close that poll, and then I will share those results with you.
Okay, I'm a little surprised, if I'm blunt here, that it isn't higher in that first box, that the policy and plans were already compliant with the new expectations, and that may link with the about a quarter of you saying, just over a quarter of you saying that you don't know, and there is again a similar number of you that's saying yes, you've got your new curriculum in place and it's all ready to go for September. Because there was some tensions around some of the relationship and sex elements of this, one would have expected that boards would have been a little bit more informed about the plans as they were coming here. Some of that may be reflected in the reviewed policy, and the policy was the thing that often gave you the consultation aspect with your school community. I think the question here probably is to go away and find out, sensitively find out, because of course schools are very busy with other things at the moment. But if we move on to the next slide, I think maybe I'll frame some comments in response to the poll around that. The first thing that the board will need to do is to make sure that the school is ready to meet that new duty. And given your response to the poll, there's already some questions for you there to ask. And I think it is important. I think this is strong business for the urgent and important in some respects, because I think the second bullet point and third bullet point really are important with children going back to school. A part of the new requirements is the provision for mental health and well-being, and for all of the reasons that I've already described, there will be a need to address these across a whole range, not only behaviour but also the mental health aspects of this across the school when children are returning, both now and in greater numbers in the future. There will be a requirement to reflect on whether the design of the curriculum that had been created before we moved into the coronavirus situation will meet the needs, whether it needs a little bit of redesign in the ways we've already discussed to meet the needs of some groups of children, some of which are yet to be identified, and then going on from that, because it will be statutory from the 1st of September, we need to ensure that our governance for the next academic year monitors the impact of the changes and compliance with the expectations of that area of the curriculum. So I think there are some things here that many of you will need to go back and unpick sensitively as you look at, and there may be some questions that you can reflect back on. So how does that impact with our new responsibility under the RSHE guidance for the 1st of September? The questions that currently fit in reopening can also be shaped against this new guidance. And I'm sure that your schools will not be ignorant of the fact that they have been preparing for this, and maybe it's just that they haven't shared in enough detail with you for you to understand that they are actually aiming to meet that duty, or in fact had already met the duty last September and have moved on and looked at other things. But there are some questions here that I think you just need to reassure yourself as a board member that your school is up and ready and can reflect on how it will support this compliance on an ongoing basis. Any further questions, Steve, or am I hand?
Yes, a couple of further questions here. You've covered the post-COVID issues here, but Michael's got a question. Is there anything in the new curriculum that reflects its application to special needs children? For instance, some parents of these children have never envisaged it as part of their particular child's curriculum.
In special educational needs schools, so if we're talking about special schools, then the curriculum is tailored to the needs and understanding of the individual child. And if a child is not going to be able to be fully responsible for taking on some of their own management of these issues, then clearly it will be adapted and tailored to meet their needs. But there is an expectation that we don't make assumptions that certain elements of society don't engage with things because it's unpleasant or distasteful. It is about the level of understanding and knowledge that we can deliver for that particular individual. Did you want to add anything there, Steve, or have I covered what you would?
I think that's fine. And we've got a couple of questions coming in from people about any ideas on how we could monitor RSE, and particularly how we could monitor the impact of it.
Well, it's the same as with any other curriculum areas. There are some things that we would expect to be included in the head teacher's report. It is an area of statutory compliance, so we would need to ensure that we get reports and information from school. We would need to look at that also in relation to some of the other things that happen within the school in terms of reports about incidents, for example, and that would shape maybe some questions for governors about, well, if we're meeting this new duty, why are we having an increase in say homophobic bullying, when actually we've done a lot of work on making sure that children are inclusive and understand positive relationships and respect for others. So there's a whole range of things there that will link backwards and forwards to give you that evidence trail.
I think you're absolutely right, Linda, and I think as governors it's worth thinking about there isn't just one way to do this. As Linda says, there's a whole raft of different areas of evidence we could look for. Yvonne's just come in with a suggestion it might be useful to monitor the concerns, complaints, etc. So yeah, absolutely. Pupil surveys, staff surveys, all of those will provide a valuable insight, because there's some very relevant questions there in terms, particularly on the relationship side, and I think certainly with our responsibilities for not just behaviour and attitudes, but also personal development, we would want to be looking for evidence. Some of that may be anecdotal, that's fine, it doesn't make it any less valid, but I think as governors it's actually worth thinking about, are we monitoring, or have we got plans in place to monitor when schools do resume to perhaps a more normal pattern of operation? Have we got monitoring systems in place that give us a breadth of evidence rather than just a very narrow view on this? Okay, lovely. We'll move forward at that stage, and the next topic we want to cover, again, is just a quick one on school capital funding. This is an area, again, quite recent, as you can see. This is a week ago yesterday, 27th of May, that this was actually published by the government. And this really is an update on what schools can expect in terms of capital funding in the next 12 months. Now, all schools are eligible for devolved formula capital. Academies and academy trusts, of course, have to put their bids through into the Education Skills Funding Agency, maintain schools through the local authority for other capital projects. But this is just to notify schools of the methodology that has changed slightly this year, but also how you can actually find out how much money your school is actually going to get. Now we're going to talk a little bit about perhaps casting our eyes forward in terms of financial matters relating to the school and governance towards the end of the session, but really this is just to raise awareness that this is out there, and as we said at the beginning, the URL, the link for this particular page on the DfE website is actually included in the penultimate slide. And really this just leads to a couple of questions for us as governors. Did we know this happened? I mean, it's not terribly helpful coming out in half term, of course, but in some of our schools, I'm sure our bursars, school business managers, finance directors will be very aware of this, but might be a good question just to raise. Forward the link on, did we know this had actually come out? Do we know how much our school is actually going to get? I happen to be chair at 2 schools. As part of my research for this session today, I looked up and I know the infant school where I'm chair, we're going to get just under £6,000, and the very large secondary school I'm chair of, we're going to get something like £33,500. Now, you know, those are not insignificant sums of money, but they go nowhere near the capital needs of the school. So I think one of the things that we need to think about is the second question here: has our governing board reflected on the capital programme that perhaps is necessary in our school, and where is the money going to come from to actually do that? Have we got other bids, other grants, other requests actually in the system? Again, this may not, in some instances it will be urgent. For most of it, this probably hasn't been urgent business, so therefore this might need to come into that last section on business as usual. But that's all I wanted to say on capital funding. Sorry, just a quick question has come in from Gary here. Gary is saying, and just going back to RSHE here, there are also regional leads offering funded RSHE training. And that's happening in quite a few areas. I must admit that's something I wasn't actually aware of. Gary, thank you for that. If you'd like to send me a link, we'll very happily share that with everybody who's on the webinar later on today through Governors for Schools. But yeah, so that might be something everybody else wants to have a look at. So that's, I'm assuming from what you're saying, Gary, that's regional leads offering training to school staff. Thank you very much indeed for that. Okay, so let's move on at that stage to the next section, and this is a safeguarding issue, new initiative launched by government the week before last. This was actually launched on the 22nd of May. It's called Hidden Harm, and this is a reflection. Apparently it was on the cards anyway. It's something that I think has probably gained rather greater traction during the lockdown, primarily because of the first of the bullet points or sub-bullet points in that second section there. Domestic abuse has been on the increase. It's one of the sad consequences, unfortunately, of lockdown, is that we have seen a very dramatic increase in quite a few of our settings where pupils are being exposed to significant areas of domestic abuse, and yeah, in terms of witnessing them and possibly some of them being victims as well. We saw the Home Secretary do a major piece on this about 4 or 5 weeks ago now, and this culminated in a summit that was launched by the Prime Minister on the 22nd, and it's a new initiative aimed at tackling 3 areas of crime-related activity which have a massive impact on children and young people's safeguarding. So domestic abuse, not just violence, domestic abuse, that can be verbal as well, of course. That's something that, as I say, is touching an awful lot of schools at the moment. Child sexual abuse, again, something that a lot of schools will be aware of. the massive spike in the amount of time as a country, as a world, we are spending online now. Witness what we're all doing right now. But lots of young people and children with lots of extra time and not a great deal of variety in avenues to actually go down are spending more time online, and that has led to some very real concerns about increased grooming online and other forms of sexual abuse that can emanate from that. And then also something that's been bubbling on in the background for a long time is concerns that the government has about modern slavery and the impact of that does spill over into our schools, etc. So this is the start of a new initiative. There's lots of guidance has actually been published on it, and I think as governors all we wanted to do for you today was really raise awareness of this. Again, you have the link to the main government website, and there are lots of links off there. But again, as we said before, with all of these things, do we know as governors that people in our school, the leadership team specifically, are aware of this new initiative? Do we also know about our school's context? One of the key elements of the effective governance of safeguarding at this particular point in time is, are we aware as governors what our safeguarding context is rather? Do we know what the main issues that present themselves in our schools on a day-to-day basis are? And are any of these three factors that we've talked about within this hidden harm initiative actually represented within that? And I think one of the things that is linked to that, which certainly all of us ought to be aware of, many local authorities who have oversight of safeguarding for all schools in their geographical areas, has been to recommend governing bodies, governing boards to make changes to their safeguarding policy in terms of what's happening this year. I think the other thing for us to think about is that for child sexual abuse, particularly relating to online safety and guidance for parents, that was republished early part of April. That's something that schools should have been sharing for not just those children and young people returning to school now, but those who are perhaps going to be remaining at home for the foreseeable future. So a good question to ask there, which is actually in support of the general direction that this guidance is moving in. Okay, so I don't see any questions coming through at the moment, so we'll move on at that stage and hand back over to Linda for the last section of this morning's Hot Topics.
A lot of my work is also with clerks, and clerks and board members were asked at the beginning of the corona crisis to concentrate on urgent and important business, but the guidance was very clear that governance continues. There's been no change to the statutory functions of governance, so there are still things that will either have been postponed to a later date or will not have made it onto the urgent and important virtual meeting agenda. And I'm hoping that for all of your boards, there has been at least one meeting or scheduled meeting that occurs over the current summer term. So we should be expecting in all but this, those local advisory boards as part of a multi-academy trust that have had their all of their meetings suspended and work taking place at trust level. So if your trust is meeting, that may negate the necessity for you to meet virtually, but for all maintained school boards and for those that have quite a level of delegation, local academy boards may also be included here. There should be a meeting so that governance can be seen to continue. There are some things that we would normally be doing at this time of the year that we maybe haven't shaped into those agendas yet. And whilst we're not suggesting that now is the time to start raising these things with your senior leaders, because they will be very much engaged around the reopening plans either at the moment or their plans for September, because we still don't have detailed knowledge of how that is going to progress. But we should keep our eye on these elements of governance and make sure that they are included. It may be they're included bit by bit as the picture unfolds. Our school development plan priorities for next year, they may have a very similar shape to them as we had expected them to come based on the data that we would normally have received. But we may well have normally at this time of the year been talking to our senior leadership team in our meetings about what those plans will be looking like in terms of the creation of those draft plans for our agreement in the autumn term. So as the situation becomes clearer and as we move from the urgent and important into the virtual meetings that says what comes next, we need to have in our mind that governance, all of the governance function is based on having a plan that we then monitor, and the plan needs to reflect the needs of the school. So we do need to keep that strategic head on and say what will be our priorities for next year. They may be shaped around some of the things we've already talked about today. That has an impact, obviously, on the curriculum. We've talked about some of those aspects as we go along. That developing the curriculum was a piece of work that was already going on in most schools. Some schools are already ready with their new curriculum. How might some of the things that have happened in the last few weeks then need a reflection and inclusion in what that curriculum looks like for the next academic year? And of course, many schools have gone to an incredible expense to be able to put in place both the programme for the essential workers children and to put in place plans for reopening in a safe way based on their risk assessment. And there will be budgetary considerations. It may not impact on our immediate plan for the current year, but what happens to our projected costs in years 2 and years 3? So we need to unpick that. Maybe now, today is not the day, but we will need to give that some very clear consideration as we move into the autumn term. So don't lose sight of that. Against the 3 functions of governance, we've got strategic priorities, number 1. We've got ensuring that we hold the school to account for the performance of pupils and staff, so curriculum and outcomes, staff performance management. And then we've got best value, and that is our, those are our roles. So these things need to form part of our thinking and planning. And the appraisal process for staff, I understand that the school teachers review body has met, and they have made a recommendation. We would normally get that information for a 1st of September publication. Whether that will meet that date, we are not as yet clear, but the entitlement to performance management remains. And we also need to think as a board, with these things still our priorities, how good are we as a board at being ready ourselves? Have we reflected on our own performance and the leadership of governance, both our individual leadership of areas that we're responsible for, or committees that we belong to, but also that wider review of the board itself, which often takes place in the summer term, and the reflection of that review, the output, the report, or whatever it is that happens in your board, that then shapes any changes, any training that we need to undertake as a board for the following year, any recruitment that we need to make. So the business of governance continues. One thing that I see maybe that I would mention just very quickly is recruitment and retention of governors. So these processes are still expected to take place. We still need to make sure we've got succession planning in place for our chair and vice chair, if that would normally happen at this time of the year. So these things need to be in our minds, and then need to be built in as and when the situation in our school allows them to be discussed and understood in greater depth, but we shouldn't lose sight of them.
There's a question come in, Linda, here from Anne, who's saying, was performance management suspended during lockdown, and will it continue and be extended from September 2020? I mean, my view is it wasn't officially, but I think pragmatically, certainly the process has actually been probably put on hold for the time being. No changes have been made to regulation, so the assumption is that it will continue, but I think governing bodies will have to take a very pragmatic view of, because of the fact that there's been a closure programme, you know, what progress has the school made against improvement priorities that Linda's just been talking about in that intervening period, and how will that be picked up as and when, and whether that's September or not, we don't know at this point, but as and when we're back into perhaps a more normal pattern of operation.
And the mid-years reviews, I know some schools had already held some of those when we closed at on the 20th of March. but for probably quite a large number of boards, there won't have been a formal mid-year review of people's targets when they would have been revised if circumstances demanded they be revised. So I think it will need a pragmatic approach. But once we have seen that that document, then I'm sure that we will come back to you with something on appraisal generally once the picture is clearer. But at the moment, there have been no official changes, and until we see what the output from that review document looks like, we're not in a position to make comments on that. We will need, obviously, to use our common sense, if that isn't a rude word to use in current circumstances, to say, given our circumstances, given what the guidance says, given what has happened and the impact it has had on our school, these are some of the decisions that we will need to make. But at the moment, we would be speculating. So we have a poll attached to this this last slide that Steve is going to load up now. And this is really just about reflecting on, in terms of your board business, where are you in terms of your expectations going forward? So please vote for as many as apply in your circumstances.
So the votes are coming in here. We've just over 50% of people have voted now. Jumped up to nearly 70, so that's lovely. Okay, so we're just at 80% of you have voted now, folks. If you would like to vote, please do so now, because we're going to close that poll in just a few moments and move on. Great, I think that's nearly everybody has voted now, so I'm going to close that poll and then I can share those results with you, and they should be up on your screen now.
So I think this is quite positive in terms of there are many of you that are already thinking and have seen even if it's in draft format, a new school development plan for next year. I would suggest there might be some reflection on the appropriateness and the detail of that once we have all pupils back in school. The reviewed appraisal and pay policy, yes, this is an ongoing and that we should have some attention on this each year. So I know certainly there have been some changes in my own school where I'm chair to those policies this year. So that's great that almost half of you have thought about that and have that in place. I am very reassured by almost 80% of you having a 3-year financial plan. And again, we may, as I have suggested, need to reflect on the expenditure for reopening and what that has done to that 3-year plan. The curriculum review in half your schools, you are aware that that has been completed. So there are some questions there for those of you that don't know what's happened about that to ask. And for those of you that are not sure about any of these things, I accept that some of you will be very new governors, and some of what we've been talking about will be new information to you. If you are new to the board, I would have an initial conversation with your chair or your clerk to say, where would I find out a little bit more information about this? And then for all board members, any of these questions where you're not clear, it is about feeding those conversations in at board level. And your question, no matter how naive it may appear to you, will help all board members understand and reinforce their knowledge of each of these subjects. And it is beneficial. I always enjoy having new governors on my board because they ask questions that sometimes I haven't thought about for a long time. And it is very good to have that reflection time and to be sure, is my knowledge current and up to date, or am I making that assumption based on something that I was told in the past as a governor? So all of these areas we've touched on, they all are important. They all have statutory expectations attached to them. and they form part of our overall governance, and we shouldn't be drawn unnecessarily into operational issues, no matter how that seems our life is being drawn at the moment. But we should start to refocus and reshape our thinking around what are our strategic responsibilities for this organisation that we sit on the board, to ensure that it is compliant and moving forward in a way that has been carefully planned and is leading to improved outcomes in those areas of responsibility. Anything else you wanted to say, Steve, or we're open for general questions, obviously?
No, I'll hide the results of that poll there now and just go back to the end. We've got a couple of questions that have actually come through. Sorry, excuse me. Well, this is more of a commentary from Alison. Alison saying in her local authority, the Director of Children's Services has reminded governors that the DfE has actually suggested that head teachers actually keep account of all of the costs incurred in relation to the current COVID-19 crisis, because there will be financial support available. I think, yes, Alison, you're absolutely right. There are no details yet about where that financial support will come from, and of course that ranges for, in the initial stages before the free school meals voucher scheme was introduced, lots of schools spend a lot of money on food vouchers for supermarkets, etc. There is no inkling at the moment as to how or if reimbursement for those kind of things are. Schools certainly should be keeping records, but I think hopefully most head teachers will be aware of that. But of course, as Linda said, there have been some significant areas of expenditure linked with the virus, but not only that, but schools have lost massive amounts of lettings incomes in some cases as well. We've then got a question from Samantha, who's actually saying schools are quite rightly discouraging external visitors, including governors. How do you recommend that the usual link governor role continues, specifically with regard to the SDP, etc., during the current situation and going on into the autumn term?
I think link visits is a really interesting one. I think first and foremost, I would say no governor should be going into school for any reason. Governance face-to-face of any kind is explicitly not allowed at the moment. We are currently operating in a virtual world. We do have the benefit of technology, so we have had correspondence between governors in terms of leads happening by email. There is no reason why a video call couldn't be arranged for a link visit if we are continuing in this way into the autumn term. But we shouldn't have any governor thinking that now is the time to either go into school for a visit or check that risk assessments are being carried out, or to resume any kind of face-to-face meetings.
Can I just come in on that one there, Linda? We've got quite a few questions and statements coming through from a number of people saying that, can we qualify where that comes from? The health and safety governor has to go in. I think we need to be quite emphatic on this, folks. The government guidance is absolutely crystal clear on this. No unnecessary trips should be made at the moment in school. Schools are open for only work at those key worker children, children with EHPs, etc. And from this week, that phased reintroduction. That does not mean that we as governors are supposed to go in. We should be staying at home, and we should not be going into school. Anybody going into school at the moment is actually breaking those bubbles, as they're being called, potentially risking the health and well-being of staff. And as governors, we have a duty of care apart from anything else. So governors should not, absolutely should not be going into school at the moment. That is totally in accord with government guidance. So no matter what your role is, governance is a remote activity at this point in time.
And remember, your role is strategic and not operational. So you do not actually have to see it in the flesh for yourself to test whether it is in place. There are other ways of doing that. Reports, information, data, photographs, virtual meetings, virtual visits, telephone conversations. I know many finance governors have for many years held the school to account by having telephone conversations with bursars on a regular basis. It does not need to be face-to-face.
Okay, we've got another question that's come in here from Sorry, there's a lot of questions coming. I've lost my place from Anne. Sorry, Anne. Anne saying, maybe this is a simple question, but should all schools have been deep cleaned, and should all schools have temperature checks of pupils and staff on entering the building? It is for individual schools, Anne, to actually determine their own approach to this. The government has produced guidance. There is nothing in that guidance at all that suggests that children should be temperature checked. I would personally suggest, and Linda and I have talked about this because it's come up in a couple of conversations we've had recently, that is totally over the top and not in any way appropriate at all. Schools should put measures in place to, wherever possible, keep children socially distanced and to create those barriers or the bubbles that are actually being talked about. Reasonableness is the key test here, and that's what governors actually need to be thinking about. Have we acted reasonably? Have we put as many measures in place as we can to protect staff, pupils, and ultimately their families? It's not about us trying to second guess every single measure and procedure that's been put in place. The question for governance at a strategic level is saying, is this reasonable? Have we done everything that we reasonably could to ensure, wherever it is possible, the safety of staff and children?
And have we based our plan on our risk assessment? Because different school buildings, different types of schools will have different challenges, and it is about the risk assessment happens first, and then if the risk assessment suggests that a certain activity is required in the plan, then that is on which it is based. So the question might be, what is the risk and the rationale for therefore taking a particular action if we're asking a question as a governor?
Indeed. And I'm sorry, folks, we have actually run out of time there. We've got a few questions that we haven't actually got to. We will actually review all of the questions that have been submitted, and if you haven't had a response online, over the webinar duration, we will certainly get back to you with an email later on today. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and do come back again soon for future webinars. We look forward to seeing you again. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.